All Quiet on the Western Front, 1930 war film based on a novel by Erich Maria Remarque. It takes place during the First World War and recollects the experiences of average foot soldiers on the German side. From the moment they enlist with enthusiasm, sold on promises of glory and honor by their elders, through their experiences in the actual trenches, going without food, water, shelter, sitting in a ditch for days on end, being bombed continuously, and watching their friends die in front of them, to the detachment and feeling of disconnect from society that they experience upon the return from the war, or even just going on leave and visiting their families for a couple of days. In some ways, it bears resemblance to Full Metal Jacket, which I think was at least partially inspired by it. The book was written by Remarque, in part based on his own experiences during the war, and it shows because the picture painted by it and by the book and the film adaptation is quite vivid and feels very real. It is obviously full of tragedy, but most of that tragedy is buried beneath the dullness of everyday life. Everyday war life, actually. The soldiers become disillusioned with patriotism and politics, and in time they even stop caring about the mortar shelling above their heads as much. Just take it in stride, along with injuries and deaths. And that's the best case scenario because we're also shown examples of more significant impact of warfare on mental health. To me, what's amazing about it is how easy it is to sympathize with the characters from basically minute one, despite the fact that they're Germans. And I think to an extent we've been conditioned to associate Germans during the war with being unequivocally the bad guys, which I think paints the wrong picture. And it's mostly because of World War II and the atrocities committed by the Nazis. And because if you think about World War One and go back to the records of that time, that wasn't really a war led on moral principle. It was mostly political tensions between the powers that be that eventually blew up and ended up costing the lives of millions of young soldiers who, like the ones in the film, didn't really have anything to fight for there, didn't have a personal stake. Back then, it wasn't really a clear case of the good guys versus the bad guys as it was with the Nazis in World War II. It was just one army against another, and I think the film being from the perspective of the Germans drives that point home. It humanizes the other side of the conflict and shows us that hey, actually, a lot of those soldiers were not evil fanatics who wanted to kill us all just because. They went to war because they were told to. And the movie does touch on that aspect as well, on old people comfortably sending their youth to die in senseless wars, on how easy it is to have the moral high ground in terms of things like courage and patriotism when you're not the one required to display them. Of course, those themes were not understood by quite everybody at the time of the movie's release. The Nazi Party, already at power in Germany, banned the film across the country because they thought it shows the cowardice of German troops. On the other hand, Poland also banned the film on the grounds that it glorified the German army. So, which is it then? You really can't have both. Well, seeing the movie today, it's quite obvious that it isn't either, really. I don't think that the movie even takes a political stance. I think it's not about countries, it's about people instead. It's also quite incredible to think about how soon after the war ended this movie was made and released. It was just 12 years. I mean, when we think about World War One or even World War Two now, it seems like so long ago because my generation obviously doesn't remember it. But then you watch a film like this and realize that at the time it was basically a contemporary story. I mean, many of the people involved in the production, that's both the crew and the cast, actually did have experience during the war. Final point that I want to make is that even though the film is very good, I think, at tackling its themes and exploring the futility of war, and I thought it makes its point quite clearly and eloquently, it seems like it went not really understood because the bans on the film in certain countries are one thing, but think about how many wars we've had since then. It's like the message continues to fall on deaf ears. Every time there's a war, there will be people afterwards telling their experience from it, which essentially always boils down to war is horrible, people senselessly die, and we should just be at peace all the time. And yet, the cycle continues, which, as sad as a realization as it is, I do think it's worth something worth thinking about.